Imagine dedicating your whole life to raising your children, only to be humiliated by them at your own dinner table. This is the real story of how one elderly father turned that pain into the most unexpected decision of his life. It was March of 2022, one of those strangely humid Saturday afternoons that Chicago always manages to squeeze out, even when the calendar insists it's still late winter. The kind of day where the air clings to your skin, not enough to make you sweat, but just enough to remind you that. I remember standing in my kitchen, sleeves rolled up, working on a dish that had become something of a family tradition, beef stroganoff. I'd been cooking that same recipe since my boys were small. Fresh mushrooms from the farmer's market, heavy cream whipped by hand until it nearly floated, and noodles that I made sure were never too soft. I wasn't just making dinner, I was trying to serve up a memory, something familiar that would remind them of the days when our home was loud with laughter and small footsteps. The dining table was dressed for the occasion. I laid out the embroidered tablecloth I'd received as a wedding gift decades ago. It was one of those heirlooms that survived all the messes of family life, spilled juice, late-night pizza stains, and birthday cake crumbs. I brought out the crystal glasses that rarely saw the light of day. I saved them for special occasions, and this, I believed, was one of them. After all, how often does a father get to celebrate all three of his sons earning promotions at the same company? Robert, my eldest, arrived first. He's the kind of man who prides himself on punctuality, though I often joke that he's only ever early when free food is involved. At 45, Robert had the kind of body that spoke of long hours behind a desk, punctuated by expensive business lunches. He had developed the executive belly, as I called it, and he carried himself with that subtle air of superiority that people in corporate suits often pick up like a bad habit. He hugged me quickly, a tap on the back more than an embrace, and then went straight to the table, commenting on the smell of the food. Soon after, Daniel came in, the middle child, always juggling too many things at once. He was still on a business call as he walked through the door, waving at me with one hand while shushing whoever was on the other end of the line. Daniel was 38, sharp-minded, ambitious, and always in a hurry. He kissed me on the cheek absent-mindedly, then immediately started complaining about traffic, as though I had any control over Chicago's Saturday gridlock. Finally, Mark, the youngest at 34, strolled in. Mark was the free spirit, the one who seemed to float through life with less weight on his shoulders. He was always cracking jokes, often at inappropriate moments, but it was part of his charm. He came in grinning, tossing his jacket on the couch, and teasing Robert about his growing waistline before even saying hello to me. For a moment, as I watched them gather around the table, I felt a familiar warmth. They were grown men now, with careers, responsibilities, and their own lives, yet here they were, my boys, under my roof, about to share a meal together. I thought to myself, this is what it's all about. This is the reward of fatherhood. We sat down, and the plates clinked against the table as I served each of them. The beef stroganoff sat steaming on their plates, filling the room with a rich, comforting aroma. I poured wine into the crystal glasses, raising mine with a shaky hand and saying, "To my sons, all three of you, promoted in the same company." I couldn't be prouder. They raised their glasses too, but I noticed the hesitation. The toast was met with polite smiles rather than genuine joy. Something was off. I brushed it aside at first, chalking it up to them being tired or preoccupied. As the meal went on, the conversation shifted. At first, it was about work-long meetings, endless emails, company politics. Then, it became about money, investments, and how expensive everything was becoming. They teased me lightly about still living in the same old house, about still cooking instead of ordering takeout. I laughed along, though each joke carried a sting. Then Robert, always the boldest, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Dad, you know this recipe is a little outdated. Nobody eats heavy cream anymore. It's bad for cholesterol." Daniel chuckled and added, Yeah, maybe you should learn some modern recipes, Dad, something healthier, or at least get with the times and use one of those meal delivery apps. Mark, never missing a chance to poke fun, said, or maybe Dad should just hire a cook. He's got the retirement money, right? The three of them laughed. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. It wasn't the words themselves that hurt, it was the tone. Dismissive, mocking, as if the years I had spent cooking for them, providing for them, and raising them had suddenly been reduced to a joke at the dinner table. I tried to smile, tried to shake it off. Well, maybe I like doing things the old way. It reminds me of when you were kids. But Robert wasn't done. He leaned forward and said, Dad, honestly, sometimes you're stuck in the past. You don't understand how things work now. The world's different. You should let us handle things, finances, decisions, stuff like that. You can just relax and not worry about it. The others nodded in agreement. And in that moment, it felt less like they were celebrating with me, and more like they were ganging up on me, as though I had become the child at the table, needing guidance, rather than the father who had raised them. My chest tightened, not from anger, but from heartbreak. I had imagined this dinner so differently. I thought we would reminisce about their childhood, laugh about old stories, maybe even plan a family trip. Instead, I felt humiliated in my own home, surrounded by the very people I had sacrificed for. I put down my fork quietly, suddenly not hungry anymore. The laughter continued around me, their voices blending into a blur of noise. Inside, though, something was shifting. That night, after they left, I sat alone at the table. The dishes were cold, the glasses half full. The embroidered tablecloth looked tired, as though it had absorbed not just the food stains of the past, but also the invisible wounds of the evening. I stared at the empty chairs, the spaces where my sons had sat, and I felt a heaviness settle into my bones. They didn't see me as the man who had built this life for them. They saw me as outdated, irrelevant, even laughable. And yet, beneath the pain, a quiet resolve began to form. They thought I was weak. They thought I was stuck in the past. But what they didn't know was that the very company they worked for, the company that had just promoted them all, was still under my control. They were celebrating their new positions, not realizing that their future, their paychecks, their very careers were tied directly to me. As I cleared the table that night, I made a decision. I would no longer let myself be humiliated, not even by my own blood. If they wanted to treat me like I was irrelevant, then I would show them just how relevant I still was. The next morning, I picked up the phone and made the call that would change everything. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of my dining room, casting long stripes across the table that still held the remnants of last night's dinner. A half-empty bottle of red wine leaned on its side, like a soldier too weary to stand. The smell of cold beef stroganoff lingered faintly in the air, a ghost of what was supposed to have been a celebration. I sat there for a while, staring at the table, as if expecting my sons to walk back in, laughing, apologizing, maybe saying they didn't mean the things they said, but the house was quiet, and I knew better. The truth was, their words weren't just careless jokes. They revealed something deeper, something that had been building for years, a slow shift in how they saw me. Once, I was the pillar of the family, the man who fixed everything, the man they turned to when they needed guidance. But now, in their eyes, I had become old-fashioned, outdated, someone to be humored rather than respected. I let that sink in as I nursed a lukewarm cup of coffee. My reflection in the dark liquid looked back at me, lined with wrinkles I hadn't noticed before. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was getting old. But old didn't mean powerless. You see, what my sons had forgotten or perhaps never truly understood was that I wasn't just their father. I was also the man who had built the very foundation of the company they worked for. They had walked into cushy jobs, climbed their way into promotions, and strutted around with titles, but all of it existed because of me. The company had been my life's work, Decades ago, when they were still children, I was the one who stayed up late at night, crunching numbers, meeting with partners, and taking risks that could have ruined us all. I had faced failures, bankruptcies, betrayals, and yet I had clawed my way up from nothing. The business wasn't just a source of income, it was the proof of my resilience, my determination. And in all those years, I had never once let them go hungry, never once let them feel the weight of my struggles. They thought I was stuck in the past. They thought I was too old to understand how the modern world worked, but they had no idea that I still held the final say. That morning, as the city outside began to stir with its usual clamor, sirens in the distance, buses groaning down the street, neighbors scraping ice off their windshields, I picked up the phone. I dialed a number I hadn't called in months, the office of the board secretary. The voice on the other end greeted me with respect, the kind that reminded me who I truly was. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. How can I help you today?" I cleared my throat, my voice steady but carrying the weight of decision. "Schedule an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. I'll be there in person." There was a pause, then a quick acknowledgement. "Yes, sir, I'll notify the board members right away." There's Sel's code. When I hung up, I leaned back in my chair and exhaled. The decision was made. I wasn't acting out of spite, though part of me wanted to. No, this was about more than my bruised pride. This was about respect, about reminding my sons and everyone else that I wasn't just a relic sitting at the dinner table. I was still the man who had built the empire they now enjoyed. The drive to the company headquarters later that day felt strangely familiar. I'd made that trip thousands of times before, but this time, it carried a different weight. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, not from nervousness, but from determination. The city passed by in a blur of grey and brown buildings, streets lined with slush, pedestrians hurrying with their collars turned up against the wind. Chicago had a way of looking both alive and tired at the same time, much like me. When I arrived, the building stood tall and sleek, glass panels reflecting the pale afternoon sky. It looked modern, impressive, nothing like the small, dingy office where I had first started decades ago. I stepped through the revolving doors, and the receptionist immediately straightened up. She knew me. Everyone in this building knew me, whether they had met me personally or only heard stories whispered in the break room. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thompson," she said warmly. I nodded, offering a faint smile. "Good afternoon." Walking through those halls was like walking through time. Every corner, every office held memories of struggles and victories. I remembered late nights when I'd sleep on the office couch, early mornings fueled by stale coffee, and countless arguments with partners who doubted my vision. And now, here I was, an old man with greying hair and tired bones, yet still carrying the authority to shape futures. The boardroom was already filling up when I entered. Men and women in suits, some younger, some older, all of them powerful in their own right, stood as I walked in. Respect wasn't demanded here, it was given, naturally, because they understood what I represented. I took my seat at the head of the long mahogany table, and silence settled over the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice calm but firm, "thank you for coming on such short notice. I won't waste your time. I've made a decision regarding 3 of our employees, Robert, Daniel, and Mark Thompson." The room shifted uncomfortably. My sons' names carried weight in this building, not just because of their recent promotions, but because everyone knew they were my children. "I know what you're thinking," I continued, raising a hand. "Yes, they are my sons. But this is not a matter of family, it's a matter of integrity, of respect, and of leadership. Last night, I saw something in them that cannot be allowed to fester in this company. Arrogance, entitlement, a lack of respect, not just for me, but for the values this business was built on. A murmur rippled through the room, but no one interrupted. I built this company with sweat and sacrifice, and I refuse to let it become a playground for my sons' egos. Effective immediately, Robert, Daniel, and Mark Thompson are terminated from their positions. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Some board members looked shocked, others curious, and a few, I noticed, seemed relieved. "Are there any objections?" I asked. None came. "Good," I said. "Then it's done." When I left the building that evening, the air felt colder, sharper, as if the city itself had taken notice of what I'd done. My phone buzzed relentlessly, calls from Robert, from Daniel, from Mark. I didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, I drove home, parked the car, and sat in the driveway for a long while. My hands trembled slightly, not from regret, but from the enormity of the decision. I had just fired my own flesh and blood, but I reminded myself, it wasn't about punishment, it was about a lesson. Sometimes the hardest lessons come from those who love you most. When I finally went inside, the house was dark, quiet, still carrying the echoes of last night's laughter. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty table once more, and whispered to myself, "They'll understand one day. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day they'll see why I had to do it." That night, as I lay in bed, the phone still buzzing on the nightstand, I thought back to when they were boys. I remembered Robert's first school play, Daniel's science fair project, Mark's endless jokes at the dinner table. I remembered how their eyes once lit up when I walked into a room. Somewhere along the way, that light had dimmed, replaced by pride, ambition, and arrogance. But maybe, just maybe, stripping away their comfort would reignite something else in them. Humility, gratitude, respect. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deep, unshaken. For the first time in years, I felt like I had taken control, not just as a father, but as a man. Tomorrow, I knew, would bring a storm, but I was ready to face it. The storm didn't wait until morning, it arrived with the sunrise. When I woke, my phone was still buzzing on the nightstand, the screen lit with missed calls and unread messages. Robert had left 5 voicemails. Daniel, 3. Mark, 1 long text that looked like it had been typed furiously, every word in capital letters. I sat at the edge of my bed for a while, staring at the phone. My first instinct was to answer, to soothe the tension, to explain myself. That was the father in me, the part that still saw them as boys who needed guidance. But another part of me, the part that had made that decision in the boardroom, knew that explanations wouldn't matter. Not yet. They weren't ready to hear it. Instead, I showered, dressed, and made myself breakfast. Eggs, toast, black coffee. Simple. Familiar. My routine was my anchor, and I clung to it that morning as the world around me threatened to come undone. By the time I finished, there was a knock at the door. Not a polite one, but a heavy, urgent pounding. I didn't need to guess who it was. When I opened the door, all 3 of them stood there, Robert in his press suit, Daniel with his phone still in hand, Mark with his arms crossed and jaw clenched. We stared at each other for a moment, the air thick with tension. "Dad," Robert said first, his voice tight, "what the hell did you do?" I stepped aside silently, gesturing for them to come in. They filed past me, the energy they carried filling the house like a storm cloud. In the living room, they didn't sit. They stood in a line, like prosecutors ready to present their case. "You fired us," Daniel said, his voice louder than usual. "You actually fired us? Do you have any idea what that means for us? For our careers?" Mark shook his head, almost laughing in disbelief. "You can't be serious, Dad. This is insane. You're punishing us because of a couple of jokes at dinner?" I took a deep breath, keeping my tone calm. It wasn't about the jokes. It was about respect, or rather, the lack of it. Robert scoffed. "Respect? Dad, with all due respect, you're overreacting. We didn't mean anything by it. You're being—" He stopped himself, but I knew what word he wanted to use. Petty, childish. I looked at each of them in turn. "Do you think I spent my life building that company just so my sons could waltz in, collect paychecks, and treat me like I don't matter? Do you think success gives you the right to belittle the very foundation you're standing on? They exchanged glances. None of them spoke. I fired you, I continued, my voice firm, because you need to learn what it means to build something on your own. You've gotten comfortable, entitled, and entitlement is poison to you, to the company, to everything I've worked for. I won't allow it. Daniel stepped forward, his face flushed. You're destroying our futures over your pride. No, I said sharply. I'm saving them. You just don't see it yet. Say think. It was knotted to again. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Finally, Mark broke it. His tone was softer, almost pleading. Dad, we get it, okay? Maybe we crossed a line, maybe we were disrespectful, but firing us, that's nuclear. Can't you just take it back, give us another chance? I shook my head slowly. Life doesn't hand you second chances on a silver platter. If you want redemption, you'll have to earn it. The same way I did, the same way anyone does. Robert's jaw tightened. You're making a mistake, a big one. Maybe, I admitted, but sometimes mistakes are what teach us the most. They didn't like that answer. I could see it in their eyes, the mixture of anger, hurt, and betrayal. To them, I wasn't being a father. I was being an executioner. Without another word, Robert turned and stormed out, the door slamming behind him. Daniel followed, muttering under his breath, his phone already pressed to his ear. Mark lingered for a moment, his eyes searching mine, as if looking for some crack in my resolve. But when he found none, he too walked out, the weight of disappointment trailing behind him. The house fell silent again. That week was the hardest of my life. The news spread quickly through the company. 3 high-ranking employees, all sons of the founder, terminated on the same day. Whispers filled the hallways. Some employees applauded my decision, seeing it as a stand against nepotism. Others criticized me, calling me cruel, heartless. At home, the silence grew louder. Days passed without a word from my sons. The phone stopped buzzing. The house felt emptier than ever, each room echoing with memories of better times. I found myself walking through the halls at night, touching the walls, running my fingers over old family photos. Pictures of birthdays, graduations, holidays. In every frame, there were smiles, laughter, joy. I asked myself where it had all gone. When had the bond we once shared been replaced with this chasm? But even in the loneliness, I held firm to my decision, because deep down, I knew it was the only way. About a month later, something unexpected happened. I was at a small cafe near the office, sipping coffee and reading the paper, when a familiar voice called my name. Dad? I looked up, and there was Mark. He looked different. His usually neat hair was unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, and his eyes carried a weariness I hadn't seen before. Mark, I said cautiously, sit down. He slid into the chair across from me, letting out a heavy sigh. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. I've been working at a small startup, nothing glamorous, just enough to pay rent. And it's hard, Dad, really hard. I didn't realize how much you went through building something from scratch. I thought I understood, but I didn't, not until now. I listened quietly, my chest tightening. He continued, I was angry at you. I still kind of am. But I think I get why you did it. You wanted us to see the reality, not just the comfort. And I'm starting to see it. I set my cup down, my eyes meeting his. It was never about punishing you, Mark. It was about teaching you. I couldn't let you walk through life thinking success was a given. It's not. It's earned every single day. Mark nodded slowly. Yeah, I'm learning that now. The dust of the presence, you came do his the died and despokesen, the darden grain, the toning of the rections. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Robert and Daniel, however, were a different story. Robert had taken a consulting job at another firm, still dressing in his sharp suits, still carrying himself with that air of superiority. From what I heard, he spoke poorly of me in private, telling colleagues that I had lost it. That age had clouded my judgment. Daniel, always ambitious, had started networking aggressively, trying to land a position at a competitor's company. He was driven not just by the desire to succeed, but by the need to prove me wrong. They hadn't spoken to me since that day at the house. But I wasn't giving up on them. Not yet. One evening, weeks after my talk with Mark, I sat on the porch watching the sun set over the neighborhood. The sky was streaked with orange and purple, the kind of beauty that makes you forget your troubles, even for a moment. Mark came by, carrying a six-pack of beer. He sat next to me, handing me a bottle. We drank in silence for a while, the cicadas buzzing in the background. Then he said, "You know, Dad, maybe you should tell Robert and Daniel what you told me, about why you did it, about wanting us to understand, not just suffer." I sighed. "They're not ready to listen." "Maybe not," Mark admitted. "But they're your sons, and you're their dad. Sooner or later, they'll need you, and when they do, you'll need to be ready." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the beginnings of maturity in his eyes. The boyish mischief was still there, but tempered now with something new understanding. And in that moment, I realized something important. My decision had already begun to bear fruit. The weeks that followed were a test not just for my sons, but for me as well. It's one thing to make a decision in a moment of resolve, standing tall in a boardroom with authority on your side. It's another thing entirely to live with the echo of that decision in the quiet of your home, day after day. Every time I walked past the family photos, every time I set a single plate at the dinner table, the silence reminded me of what had been lost. But life has a way of revealing truths when you least expect them. And in those months, I began to see the cracks forming in each of my sons' carefully built armor. Robert, my eldest, had always been the most prideful. He wore his success like a tailored suit, pressed and spotless. For years, he thrived on the image of being in control, the executive, with answers to every problem, the man who others looked at with a mix of envy and admiration. After I fired him, he moved swiftly, almost too swiftly, into a consulting role at another firm. On the surface, it looked like he had landed on his feet. He still drove the same car, still wore his expensive suits, still posted polished updates on social media about leadership strategies and corporate vision. But beneath the surface, the shine was fading. I began to hear whispers from old contacts. Robert was struggling to keep clients, his arrogance rubbing people the wrong way. Without the foundation of our family company behind him, he was just another consultant in a crowded market. The weight of maintaining his image was starting to crush him, though he would never admit it. One evening, purely by chance, I saw him at a restaurant downtown. He was seated at a corner table, his laptop open, papers scattered around him. He looked tired, lines of stress carved into his forehead. I didn't approach him. I just watched from a distance, my heart aching. That was the curse of being a father. You could see your child drowning, but sometimes you had to let them struggle, because pulling them out too soon would only teach them that someone would always save them. Daniel, my middle son, was different. He had always been ambitious, always chasing the next opportunity, the next title, the next win. If Robert's flaw was arrogance, Daniel's was impatience. After the firing, he immediately set his sights on joining a competitor's company. He networked aggressively, sent out applications, went to interviews. At first, it seemed promising. He told mutual acquaintances that he was on the verge of a big opportunity. But then the reality set in. The industry wasn't blind. Word had spread about what happened about me firing my own sons. It didn't matter how talented Daniel was. Every potential employer hesitated. If the founder of his previous company had cut ties so decisively, what did that say about him? The rejections piled up, one after another. His confidence began to crack. I didn't see him often during that time, but I heard about him through Mark. Apparently, Daniel had started drinking more, staying out late, his sharp edges dulled by frustration. He didn't call me. He didn't want advice. He wanted to prove me wrong, but the world wasn't giving him the chance. And then there was Mark. Of the three, he was the one who surprised me most. My carefree, joking youngest son had taken the hardest fall, and yet he was the one who began to rise with the most humility. The startup he joined was small, barely scraping by, but he threw himself into the work with a determination I hadn't seen in him before. He made mistakes, plenty of them, but he learned from each one. For the first time in his life, he wasn't relying on the family name or the safety net of our company. He was on his own, and slowly I could see the change in him. He came by my house more often, not to ask for money or favors, but to talk. Sometimes he'd bring me takeout, and we'd sit on the porch eating noodles out of cardboard boxes, laughing about nothing and everything. Other times, he'd ask me questions, real questions about business, leadership, responsibility. One evening, he said something that struck me deeply. "You know, Dad," he began, staring out at the streetlights. "For the first time, I get why you worked so hard when we were kids. Back then, I thought you were just obsessed with the company. But now that I'm trying to build something, I see it. It's not about money. It's about proving to yourself that you can do it, that you're capable, that you're worth something." I looked at him, pride swelling in my chest. "Exactly, son. That's exactly it." He nodded, taking a sip of his beer. "I used to think you were just being tough on us for no reason, but now I think you were trying to prepare us for this, for real life." I smiled faintly. Maybe I was. Or maybe I was just desperate for you to see what I see, that strength isn't inherited, it's earned. Mark leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Well, lesson learned, at least for me." But while Mark was growing, Robert and Daniel were slipping further away. The distance between us widened with every passing week. They refused to answer my calls, ignored my messages. When I sent an email inviting them to dinner, hoping to rebuild the bridge, there was no reply. The silence cut deep. It's a strange kind of pain, watching your children walk away not because they have to, but because they choose to. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that they needed time, that anger fades and blood runs thicker than pride. But in the quiet of the night, doubts crept in. Had I gone too far? Had I mistaken a lesson for a punishment? The answer came one night in the form of a knock at my door. It was late, well past 10, when I opened it to find Daniel standing there. He looked nothing like the polished man I remembered. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened, his eyes bloodshot. He smelled faintly of whiskey. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking, "I don't know what to do." I ushered him inside quickly, sitting him down at the kitchen table. He buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking. "I've tried everything," he said through ragged breaths. "I've applied everywhere, interviewed everywhere. Nobody wants me. They all look at me like I'm tainted, like I'm damaged goods. I thought I was unstoppable. I thought I could make it without you. But I can't. I can't even get a damn job, Dad." I reached across the table, placing a hand on his arm. "Daniel, this isn't the end. It's just the beginning of something harder, something that will make you stronger if you let it." He shook his head violently. "No, you don't understand. I'm failing. I'm drowning. And it's your fault. You fired me. You ruined me." His words cut, but I didn't flinch. I let him vent, let him pour out the poison he'd been carrying. When he finally slumped in exhaustion, I spoke quietly. "I didn't ruin you, son. I freed you. You were living on a foundation I built, but you never learned how to lay the bricks yourself. Now you have the chance. It's painful, I know, but pain is the teacher success can never be." He didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. He stayed the night on my couch, sleeping more peacefully than he probably had in weeks. And in that moment, I knew maybe, just maybe, he was starting to understand. Robert was still unreachable. Of all my sons, he was the one most blinded by pride. He refused to see my decision as anything other than betrayal. To him, I wasn't a father teaching a lesson. I was an enemy who had taken everything from him. I worried about him the most, because I knew that when pride is all you have, the fall can break you completely. There comes a moment in every story where the tension can no longer stretch, it snaps, and when it does, the sound reverberates through everything, shaking even the strongest foundations. For me and Robert, that moment came on an unassuming Wednesday evening. No holiday, no family gathering, no grand occasion, just an ordinary night that began with silence and ended with a storm. I was at home, sitting in my study, going over some old financial ledgers. Not for the sake of business, those days were behind me, but because sometimes looking at numbers was comforting. Numbers didn't lie. They didn't play favorites. They told the truth, whether you liked it or not. The knock at the door startled me. It was firm, sharp, almost angry. When I opened it, there stood Robert. My eldest son, the man who had inherited my height, my jawline, even the streak of silver in his hair. But where I carried those traits with weariness, he carried them like armor. Or at least, he used to. That night his armor was cracked. His tie was loosened, his shirt untucked, his eyes, usually sharp and commanding, were clouded with exhaustion. He didn't wait for an invitation, he brushed past me, stepping into the house with the weight of someone who had run out of places to go. "Robert," I said carefully, closing the door. "It's good to see you." He didn't answer. He paced the living room, his hands clenched into fists. Finally, he turned to me, his voice low but trembling with fury. "You ruined me." The words hung in the air like smoke. I stayed quiet, giving him space. He went on, each sentence tumbling out faster than the last. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you know what it's like to walk into a room where everyone used to respect you, only to see pity in their eyes? Do you know what it feels like when clients whisper behind your back, when colleagues avoid you, when people question whether you're even competent?" He laughed bitterly, though there was no humor in it. "I used to be somebody, Dad. I used to be a leader, and now I'm a joke. A washed-up executive who can't even keep a client list." I let him vent, every word stabbing deeper into my heart. He wasn't wrong, my decision had cast a long shadow over his career. But there was more to it than that, and he needed to see it. When he finally stopped, his chest heaving, I spoke softly. "Robert, you built your success on a foundation you didn't create. You walked into rooms with confidence because you carried my company's name. But the moment that name was gone, the confidence crumbled. That's not leadership, son. That's dependency." His eyes flashed with anger. "Dependency? I worked harder than anyone. I earned every promotion, every deal. You think I coasted just because I was your son?" "No," I said firmly. "I think you never learned the difference between authority given and authority earned." Silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Robert sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. "I don't know who I am without the company, without you." That admission hit me harder than his anger ever could, because in that moment I saw not the arrogant executive, but the little boy who used to follow me around the office, tugging at my sleeve, asking to help. I sat across from him, my voice gentle. "You're still Robert, my son, a man with intelligence, with drive, with potential. But you've built your identity on titles and paychecks. It's time to build it on something deeper, something no one can take from you." He looked up at me, eyes red. "And what if I can't? Then you'll learn. The same way I did, the same way every man does, by failing, by trying again, by refusing to quit." We sat in silence for a while. The tension that had once felt unbreakable was softening, not gone, but shifting into something more vulnerable. And then, to my surprise, Robert whispered, "I hate you, but I need you." I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to love me right now, son. You don't even have to like me. but I'll always be here, not as your boss, as your father." That night marked the beginning of Robert's transformation, though it was neither quick nor easy. At first, he resisted my advice. He wanted shortcuts, quick wins, ways to regain his old status. But slowly, begrudgingly, he began to understand that real growth doesn't come from shortcuts. It comes from humility. He started small freelance projects, consulting for startups. Work that didn't carry the prestige he once flaunted, but work that demanded he earn trust from scratch. It humbled him, it frustrated him, but it also began to reshape him. For the first time, Robert wasn't leaning on my reputation, he was building his own. Meanwhile, Daniel was fighting his own battles. After his breakdown on my couch, he had started therapy. At first, he went reluctantly, convinced it was a waste of time. But slowly, it helped him unpack the pressure he'd carried for years, the need to prove himself, the fear of failure, the resentment toward me for being both mentor and rival. And Mark continued to grow in ways none of us expected. His small startup began to gain traction. Investors showed interest. He called me one night, his voice bubbling with excitement, to tell me they had landed their first big client. "Dad," he said, practically shouting into the phone, "we did it. We actually did it." I smiled, my chest swelling with pride. "No, son, you did it." And I couldn't be prouder. But as each of my sons walked their paths, one humbled, one healing, one rising, I found myself wrestling with a question I couldn't shake. Had I done the right thing? Yes, they were growing. Yes, they were learning lessons they might never have learned otherwise. But at what cost? The bonds between us were frayed, our family dinners still empty, our conversations still laced with tension. Sometimes, late at night, I would lie awake wondering if I had mistaken discipline for cruelty. If I had been so focused on teaching them resilience that I had forgotten they were still my children, not just my successors. The line between father and teacher, between love and lesson, it's thinner than I ever realized. And crossing it, well, once you cross it, there's no going back. For months, life moved in separate directions. My three sons, Robert, Daniel, and Mark, each carving out their own path, each stumbling, growing, or fighting in their own way. And for me, life became a strange rhythm of solitude and waiting. Waiting for the call that might never come. Waiting for the dinner table to be full again. Waiting for my family to find its way back together. I didn't know when it would happen, or if it even could. But then, one evening, life threw us together in a way I couldn't have orchestrated if I'd tried. It was a Friday night when the phone rang. I recognized the voice instantly, Mark's, breathless and urgent. "Dad, you need to come. Now." My chest tightened. "What's wrong?" "It's Daniel. He's at O'Malley's. He's drunk, really drunk, and he's not okay. I don't know what to do." Without another word, I grabbed my coat and keys. O'Malley's was a dimly lit bar tucked in a corner of Chicago I hadn't visited in years. When I walked in, the smell of beer and stale smoke hit me like a wall. And there, at the far end, was Daniel slumped over a table, his head buried in his arms, a half-empty glass beside him. Mark was standing nearby, wringing his hands, looking more like a worried brother than the carefree kid he used to be. "Dad," he whispered as I approached, "he's been like this for hours. I couldn't just leave him." I put a hand on Mark's shoulder. "You did the right thing." Together, we lifted Daniel up. He mumbled incoherently, his words slurred, his body heavy with the weight of despair. We got him into my car, and I drove him back to my house. That night, as Daniel lay passed out on my couch, I sat across from Mark, the two of us nursing cups of coffee. "I don't get it," Mark said quietly. "He's always been the strong one, the one who had it all figured out." I sighed, staring at my son sprawled on the couch. "Strength isn't about never falling, Mark. It's about getting back up after you do. And Daniel, he's still learning how to stand without leaning on others." Mark nodded slowly. "I guess we all are." The next morning, Daniel woke with a groan, clutching his head. When he realized where he was, his expression shifted from confusion to shame. "I made a fool of myself, didn't I?" he muttered. I sat beside him. "You had a rough night. But it doesn't make you weak, son. It makes you human." He rubbed his temples, avoiding my gaze. "I don't want to be human. I want to be successful. I want to prove that I'm not a failure." I leaned forward. "Success isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right. And right now, the only person you need to convince is the man staring back at you in the mirror." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, he whispered, "I don't know if I can." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then let me help you. Not as your boss, as your father." His eyes welled with tears, and for the first time in years, Daniel didn't push me away. He simply nodded. It might have ended there, Mark and Daniel beginning to rebuild, slowly, under my roof. But fate had other plans, because later that week, Robert showed up. Not by accident, not by coincidence, but by choice. I was in the kitchen when I heard the front door open. Robert stepped inside, his expression guarded, his jaw set. He froze when he saw Daniel sitting at the table, sipping coffee. Daniel froze too. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Robert sneered. "So this is what it's come to? Hiding out at Dad's like a child?" Daniel's face darkened. "Better than pretending you've still got everything under control." The tension was instant, electric. Years of rivalry, resentment, and unspoken words boiled to the surface in seconds. I stepped between them, raising a hand. "Enough, both of you. Mays is attentions the clies is will light when never master grays." But it was too late. The argument that followed was years in the making. Robert accused Daniel of weakness, of always playing the victim. Daniel fired back that Robert was arrogant, blind to his own failures. Their words grew sharper, louder, each one a dagger thrown in anger. Mark tried to intervene, but his voice was drowned out. Finally, I slammed my hand against the table. "Stop!" The room went silent. My voice, calm but firm, cut through the storm. "Do you hear yourselves? You sound like children fighting over toys. You're not enemies, you're brothers. And whether you like it or not, you'll be brothers until the day you die." Robert glared at me, his voice dripping with bitterness. "Brothers? We were never brothers. We were competitors. You made us that way." The accusation hit like a punch to the gut. Daniel nodded slowly. "He's right. You raised us to fight for your approval, to fight for the company. And now look at us, broken, angry, lost." Their words cut deep because they weren't entirely wrong. In my pursuit to prepare them, to shape them into leaders, had I turned them against each other? I took a shaky breath. Maybe I did push you too hard. Maybe I made mistakes. But I never wanted you to be enemies. I wanted you to be strong. Strong enough to stand on your own, strong enough to stand together. Mark, quiet until now, finally spoke. His voice was steady, mature in a way that startled all of us. "Maybe it's not about what Dad wanted. Maybe it's about what we want. We've spent our whole lives trying to live up to his vision. Maybe it's time we figure out our own." The room fell silent again. Robert looked away, his jaw tight. Daniel stared at the floor. And me? I felt a mix of pride and sorrow. Because Mark was right. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about them. That night, something shifted. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet. The wounds were too deep, the anger too raw. But it was a start. For the first time, my sons weren't just lashing out at me. They were facing each other, confronting the truth of who they were and who they wanted to be. It was messy, it was painful, but it was necessary, because sometimes, before a family can heal, it has to break wide open. Arguments have a way of leaving scars long after the words are spoken. The night Robert and Daniel clashed in my living room was no different. Though no fists were thrown, the wounds cut deeper than any physical blow could. And when the storm finally settled, we were left in silence, raw, shaken, uncertain of what came next. Robert was the first to leave. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, his expression a mask of fury and pride. "I don't need this," he snapped, grabbing his coat. "I don't need any of you." And just like that, he walked out, slamming the door behind him. The echo of that slam lingered in the air long after he was gone. Daniel sat at the table, his shoulders hunched, his hands clenched into fists. Mark leaned against the wall, staring at the floor, his jaw tight. No one spoke. Finally, I broke the silence. "This isn't the end. He's angry, but he'll come back. He just needs time." Daniel shook his head bitterly. "No, he won't. He's too proud. He'd rather burn bridges than admit he's wrong." I looked at my middle son, seeing not just his anger but his fear that he might lose his brother forever. "Maybe," I said quietly, "but even the proudest man can't outrun loneliness forever." The days that followed were uneasy. Daniel stayed at my house for a while, though his mood shifted like the tide, some days quiet, reflective, others sharp and restless. He threw himself into job applications again, this time more humble, more willing to take positions beneath his former stature. It wasn't easy, but I could see the change in him. He was learning resilience the hard way. Mark visited often, sometimes staying overnight. His startup was gaining momentum, though he admitted the pressure was immense. Still, he carried himself differently now, more grounded, more serious. The carefree joker I once knew was gone, replaced by a man beginning to understand responsibility. But Robert remained absent. Weeks passed with no word, no calls, no visits. Each day without him gnawed at me. Then, one afternoon, I received a call I hadn't expected. It was from an old colleague of mine, someone still well connected in the industry. "Have you heard about Robert?" he asked cautiously. My stomach dropped. "No." "What happened?" There was a pause, then a sigh. "He's in trouble. He tried to take on too much consulting projects, investments, risky deals. It backfired. He's drowning in debt. And worse, there are whispers of a lawsuit. Mismanagement. Clients threatening to take him to court." I closed my eyes, the weight of those words crushing me. "Where is he now?" I asked. "I'm not sure. But if I were you, I'd find him before it's too late." That night, I told Daniel and Mark what I had learned. Daniel cursed under his breath, his face pale. I knew it. I knew he was spiraling. Mark frowned, his worry plain. "We have to help him, Dad." Daniel shook his head sharply. "Help him? After everything he's said? After everything he's done? He wouldn't accept help even if we offered." "Maybe not," I said quietly. "But he's still my son, still your brother. And sometimes help isn't about whether it's accepted. It's about showing up anyway." Vitheim, the great man degrade. We spent the next few days searching, calling old contacts, visiting places Robert used to frequent, even driving through neighborhoods we thought he might be in. It was Mark who finally found him sitting alone at a nearly empty diner, staring blankly at a cup of cold coffee. When we walked in, Robert looked up, his eyes hollow. For a moment he didn't speak, then he laughed bitterly. "Well, look at this, the rescue squad." His voice was laced with sarcasm, but underneath it, I heard something else: defeat. I sat across from him, meeting his gaze. "We're not here to rescue you, Robert. We're here because we care." He scoffed. "Care? You fired me. You humiliated me. You made me a pariah in this industry. And now you want to pretend you care?" My chest tightened, but I held his gaze. "Yes, because I'm still your father. Because no matter how angry you are, no matter how much you hate me right now, that doesn't change." Daniel spoke up then, his voice surprisingly steady. "He's right, Robert. You think you're the only one who's lost everything? You think you're the only one who's felt humiliated? We've all been there. The difference is, we're trying to climb back. And you're just sinking deeper." Robert's jaw clenched, his fists tightening on the table. For a moment, I thought he might explode again. But instead, He lowered his head, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix it." Those words, those 4 words, were the most honest thing I had ever heard from him. Mark reached across the table, placing a hand on Robert's arm. "Then let us figure it out together." Robert looked up, his eyes wet with unshed tears. For the first time in months, the armor was gone. The pride was cracked wide open, replaced by something raw, something real. And in that moment, I realized we were finally at the turning point. But the road to healing isn't straight. It twists, it stumbles, it demands more than just words. It demands action. Over the next few weeks, we worked together, helping Robert untangle the mess he had created. Not by bailing him out, no, that would have been too easy, but by standing beside him as he faced the consequences. Meetings with lawyers, negotiations with clients, restructuring debts. It was grueling, humiliating work. But Robert did it. For the first time, he didn't run, didn't hide behind arrogance. He showed up, he fought, he endured. And slowly, painfully, he began to rebuild. At home, the atmosphere shifted. For the first time in years, all 3 of my sons were under one roof. Meals together were awkward at first, silences, sharp remarks, old grudges simmering beneath the surface. But gradually, the ice began to melt. Mark cracked a joke one night at dinner, and to my surprise, Robert laughed. Not a bitter laugh, not a mocking one, a genuine laugh. Daniel rolled his eyes, but even he smiled faintly. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was something. And as I watched them, my 3 sons, broken but slowly healing, I realized that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind us. Yet even as I dared to hope, a question lingered in my mind. Had they truly learned the lessons life had forced upon them? Or were we just in a fragile truce, one argument away from shattering again? Time would tell. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the answer. Healing doesn't happen in a single conversation. It doesn't come from one apology, one shared meal, or even one heartfelt breakthrough. Healing is a slow, fragile process, a garden that needs tending day after day until the roots finally take hold. For us, for my sons and me, that process began the night Robert admitted, "I don't know how to fix it." It was the first time he'd allowed himself to be vulnerable, and from that crack in his pride, something new began to grow. But growth is never easy. The weeks that followed were a test of patience, endurance, and humility. My house, once quiet and solitary, now buzzed with life again. Robert stayed in the guest room while he sorted through his financial and legal troubles. Daniel, though he still had his own apartment, spent most nights at my place, seeking comfort in proximity. Mark, ever the bridge between his brothers, came and went, juggling his startup responsibilities with his growing role in our family's fragile reconciliation. It was strange, having them all under one roof again. Strange, but familiar too. It reminded me of the days when they were boys bickering in the hallway, raiding the refrigerator at odd hours, filling the house with noise and chaos. Only this time, they weren't children. They were grown men carrying scars, regrets, and ambitions too heavy to ignore. I tried not to interfere too much. It wasn't my place anymore to dictate their choices. Instead, I focused on listening, really listening, in a way I hadn't when they were younger. Daniel talked often about rejection, about how every job application felt like a reminder of his failures, about how exhausting it was to carry the weight of expectations, mine, his own, society's. Robert, though quieter, admitted the toll of his downfall, how the lawsuits had shaken him, how the debt kept him up at night, how he feared he would never be respected again. And Mark, my youngest, spoke about his startup. His eyes lit up when he described their progress, their struggles, their small victories. But beneath his enthusiasm, I sensed a quiet fear that he, too, might fail. That despite his best efforts, The world might swallow his dreams whole. Each of them was fighting a battle, different but equally daunting. And for the first time, I realized my role wasn't to fight those battles for them, but to walk beside them as they fought. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where Daniel and Robert nearly reignited their argument, Mark pulled me aside. "Dad," he said carefully, "don't take this the wrong way, but do you think we were ever meant to work together?" I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. "I mean, maybe we're not supposed to follow the same path. Maybe we were never meant to share one company, one legacy. Maybe that's why it all fell apart." His words stung, but I couldn't deny their truth. For years, I had dreamed of building not just a company, but a dynasty, my sons working side by side, carrying forward what I had started. But reality had shown me otherwise. Their personalities, their ambitions, their flaws, they clashed too fiercely. "Maybe you're right," I admitted. "Maybe I was trying to force something that was never meant to be." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We need to figure out our own futures, Dad, not just the one you imagined for us." That conversation stayed with me. It replayed in my mind late at night as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I had spent so much of my life building, planning, controlling. I thought if I worked hard enough, pushed hard enough, I could shape not just my own destiny, but my son's as well. But maybe love wasn't about control. Maybe love was about letting go. And so, slowly, I began to loosen my grip. Robert, with my guidance but not my interference, began to rebuild his career, not in the corporate world he once dominated, but in smaller, humbler ways. He started mentoring young entrepreneurs, sharing not just his successes, but his failures too. At first, he struggled to open up, to admit weakness. But the more he shared, the more he realized his failures made him relatable, human. His pride, once his greatest barrier, began to transform into empathy. Daniel, still searching for stable work, took a part-time job at a non-profit. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't pay much, but it gave him purpose. Helping others reminded him that worth wasn't measured only in salaries or titles. Slowly, his bitterness began to soften, replaced by a quiet resilience. And Mark's startup started gaining serious traction. They secured a round of funding, expanded their team, and landed contracts that once seemed impossible. But success didn't inflate his ego the way it once might have. Instead, it humbled him. He saw firsthand how fragile growth was, how quickly things could change, and he carried that humility with him. Watching them, I felt both pride and sorrow. Pride in their growth, sorrow in the realization that the path I had once envisioned, a united front, all of us building one empire together, was gone. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the true legacy wasn't the company I had built, but the men my sons were becoming. Then came the moment that tested everything. It was Mark's idea. He wanted us all, me, Robert, and Daniel, to attend a networking event his startup was hosting. "It'll be good for us," he said, "to show people we're not just fractured pieces of a family, but still connected." Robert resisted at first. "I don't need to stand around shaking hands like some desperate salesman," Daniel scoffed. "And I don't want to be the charity case brother tagging along." But Mark was persistent. "This isn't about you or me. It's about us. About showing that family doesn't have to mean competition." Reluctantly, they agreed. The night of the event, I watched my sons walk into the room together. For the first time in years, they weren't adversaries, they were allies, even if uneasily so. Robert spoke confidently, but not arrogantly. Daniel engaged in conversations with surprising warmth. Mark beamed with pride, introducing us to his colleagues and investors. At one point, I stood off to the side, watching them, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not because everything was perfect, it wasn't. Not because old wounds had vanished, they hadn't. But because, for the first time, I saw them not as broken pieces of a failed dream, but as individuals carving out their own lives. And that, I realized, was enough. Later that night, after the event, we gathered at my house. Nothing fancy, just pizza boxes on the table, beer bottles scattered around, laughter echoing through the walls. At one point, Robert raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said simply. Daniel smirked. "And fewer family fights." Mark chuckled. "Don't make promises you can't keep." We all laughed, the sound warm and genuine, and in that moment, I knew we weren't the same family we had once been. But maybe we were becoming something better. Life has a way of testing us when we least expect it. Just when I thought the storm had calmed, when I believed my sons and I had finally found some fragile balance, the world reminded me that peace is never permanent. It must be protected, nurtured, and sometimes fought for. It started with a phone call. I remember it clearly. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the Chicago sky in streaks of orange and purple. I was washing dishes after dinner, the radio humming softly in the background, when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something in my gut told me to answer. "Mr. Anderson?" a voice asked. "Yes, speaking." "This is Officer Martinez from the Chicago Police Department. We have your son Daniel in custody." My heart dropped. I arrived at the station within the hour, my mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. Was he hurt? Was he drunk? Had something gone terribly wrong? When I finally saw him sitting on a cold metal bench, head in his hands, I felt both relief and frustration. Relief that he was alive, frustration that we were here at all. "Dad," he muttered when he looked up, shame etched across his face. The officer explained what had happened. Daniel had gotten into an argument at a bar. Words escalated, tempers flared, and before long, punches were thrown. No one was seriously injured, but charges had been filed. As I signed paperwork and listened to the details, I couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. Just when he seemed to be finding his footing, he had stumbled again. On the drive home, silence filled the car. Finally, I asked, "Why, Daniel?" He clenched his fists. "Because I'm tired, Dad. Tired of feeling like I'll never measure up. Tired of watching Robert rebuild his image and Mark thrive while I just scrape by." His voice cracked. "I feel like the failure in this family. And when that guy at the bar called me a loser," I snapped. I didn't have the words to comfort him, not then. All I could do was drive, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary, my heart aching for a son who couldn't see his own worth. The incident shook all of us. Robert was furious. He could have ruined everything we've been working toward. One stupid mistake, and it's all back to square one. Mark was gentler but firm. "He needs help, Dad. Real help, not just advice over dinner." And they were right. Daniel needed more than pep talks or temporary fixes. He needed someone to walk with him through the darkness. So I made a decision. I convinced Daniel to attend counseling. At first, he resisted. "Therapy's for weak people," he muttered. But I countered softly, "No, son. It's for strong people who are brave enough to face their demons." After weeks of persuasion and Mark's quiet encouragement, he finally agreed. Meanwhile, Robert faced his own trial. One of the young entrepreneurs he had been mentoring accused him of being manipulative, of using his guidance as a way to gain control over their business decisions. Though the accusation was baseless, it spread quickly in professional circles. For Robert, it was a nightmare. His reputation, already fragile, threatened to crumble again. One evening, he sat across from me at the kitchen table, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "maybe I'm not cut out for this. Maybe people will always see me as the arrogant executive who fell from grace." I reached across the table, gripping his hand firmly. "Robert, people will say what they want, but you know who you are, and who you are now is not who you were then. Don't let one rumor undo all the progress you've made." It was a turning point for him. Instead of retreating, he faced the accusations head-on, inviting transparency and proving his integrity through action, not words. And slowly, the tide turned in his favor. Mark, though seemingly the most stable, wasn't without challenges either. His startup, despite its growth, hit a severe financial snag. A promised round of funding fell through at the last minute, leaving the company scrambling to pay salaries. One night, I found him in the garage, sitting on an old lawn chair, his head buried in his hands. "I thought I had it, Dad," he whispered. "I thought this was it, the big break. But what if it all collapses? What if I've dragged people along just to fail them?" "I think you said lift." I sat beside him, the air heavy with unspoken fears. "Mark, success isn't about never falling. It's about standing back up every time you do. You're not failing your team by struggling. You'd only fail them if you gave up." He didn't answer right away, but the next morning, I watched him walk into his office with renewed determination. Each of my sons was being tested. Daniel by his inner demons, Robert by his reputation, Mark by his entrepreneurial battles. And through it all, I realized something profound. These weren't just their tests. They were mine too. Could I be patient enough to support Daniel without judgment? Could I trust Robert enough to let him fight his own battles? Could I encourage Mark without smothering him with expectations? Being a father doesn't end when your children grow up. If anything, it becomes more complex. The final test came unexpectedly. Mark's startup hosted another major event this time, a pitch to investors that could make or break their future. He invited me, Robert, and Daniel to attend. "I want you all there," he said. "Win or lose, I want my family with me." The room was packed. Investors, entrepreneurs, journalists, all eyes on the stage. Mark spoke with passion, clarity, and conviction. He painted a vision of the future so vivid that even I, who had heard it countless times, felt newly inspired. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. But then came the questions, sharp, skeptical, probing. One investor, a stern-looking man in his 50s, leaned forward. "Why should we trust you? You're young, inexperienced, and your company nearly went under last quarter. What makes you think you can lead us to profit?" The room fell silent. Mark hesitated, glancing briefly at us. And in that moment, something remarkable happened. Robert stood up. "Because he doesn't give up," he said firmly. "I've worked in boardrooms my whole life, and I can tell you persistence beats experience any day." Daniel added, his voice steady, "And because he has heart. He believes in what he's building, and he makes others believe too. That's rare." I felt tears sting my eyes. My sons, who once tore each other down, were now lifting each other up. The investors nodded thoughtfully. And when the night ended, Mark's startup walked away with the funding they needed. That night, back at my house, we sat around the table, pizza boxes again, laughter again, but this time something deeper lingered in the air. We had faced the test. Each of us had stumbled, but together we had risen. And I realized then that family isn't about perfection. It isn't about living up to some ideal I had once dreamed of. Family is about standing together when the world tries to tear you apart. When I look back now, it's hard to believe how far we've come. From that humiliating dinner where my sons mocked me at my own table, to the night we stood together, united, backing Mark at his investor pitch, it feels like a lifetime has passed. But maybe that's the point. Life isn't a straight line. It twists, it bends, it breaks, and sometimes, if we're lucky, it heals. I wake up earlier these days. The mornings are quieter now. The chaos of my sons living under my roof has faded. They've each returned to their own paths. Robert has taken on a new role as a consultant, balancing mentorship with freelance work. Daniel, steady and calmer, continues therapy while growing into his role at the non-profit. And Mark is still running full speed ahead, his startup thriving, his dreams expanding. Yet even as they scatter, something has changed. The distance between us isn't as wide anymore. Phone calls are more frequent, visits more intentional. We don't wait for crises to bring us together. We choose each other, even when it's inconvenient. One Saturday afternoon, months after Mark's big pitch, we all gathered at my house again. Not for an argument, not for an intervention, not for some milestone event, just because. The smell of beef stroganoff filled the kitchen, the same recipe I had cooked countless times before. But this time, I wasn't the only one cooking. Daniel chopped mushrooms at the counter, humming softly. Robert set the table with precision, lining up the crystal glasses without complaint. Mark stood beside me at the stove, stirring the sauce, grinning like a kid again. It wasn't just a meal, it was a symbol, proof that healing had taken root, that love had endured. As we ate, laughter filled the room, stories were shared, jokes exchanged, memories revisited, and I thought to myself, this is what I wanted all along, not a dynasty, not an empire, just this, my family, together, whole in their own imperfect way. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and my sons had gone home, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the flicker of the fireplace. For years, I thought legacy was something you built with your hands, a business, a fortune, a name carved into the world. But now I know better. Legacy isn't what you leave behind in the bank or on paper. Legacy is the love you plant in the hearts of those you hold dearest. It's the conversations that mend broken trust, the patience that holds steady in storms, the forgiveness that makes tomorrow possible. And as I sat there, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. Of course, we're still a family. We still bicker, still disagree, still stumble. Robert's pride flares up now and then. Daniel has bad days when the shadows of self-doubt creep in. Mark sometimes works himself to exhaustion, chasing his dreams. But now, we face those flaws together. We don't let them divide us the way they once did, and that makes all the difference. Not long ago, a neighbor asked me, "Do you ever regret firing your sons from the company? Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" I thought about it carefully before answering. "No," I said, "I don't regret it. Because if I hadn't let go of that dream, we never would have built this reality." And this, I gestured toward the laughter spilling from my house as my sons visited that evening. This is worth more than any business ever could be. So here's what I've learned, after a lifetime of mistakes and a long road to forgiveness. Family isn't about perfection. It's about persistence. It's about showing up, even when it's hard. About choosing each other, even when the world gives you every reason not to. About believing not in who someone was yesterday, but in who they can become tomorrow. And if my story means anything to you, I hope it's this. Don't wait for tragedy to remind you of what truly matters. Don't wait until pride, anger, or ambition have burned every bridge. Pick up the phone, cook the meal, share the laugh, say the words. Because at the end of the day, when the noise fades and the world grows quiet, it won't be your successes or failures that echo in your heart. It will be the voices of the ones you love. That is my legacy. Not the company I built, not the fortune I earned, but the family I fought for, the sons I learned to see, and the love that, against all odds, survived. And if you're listening to this now, if you've stayed with me through every twist and turn of this story, I hope you carry that legacy with you too. Because no matter who you are, no matter where you've come from, one truth remains. Family is the only empire worth building.